All right, welcome to chapter 6. We're going to do integer operations. What that means is we're going to be adding and subtracting, which you've already learned, but we're going to add the multiplying and dividing on. Okay? The first lesson is multiplying integers. Next, we're going to divide integers. So today we'll be able to multiply two or more integers. We know that integers are positive and negative whole numbers. So we're going back to whole numbers, positive and negative wholes. Okay, and so there's no vocabulary because you should know what multiply means. All right, so we're going to rewrite the following multiplication facts as repeated addition or subtraction in two ways. Okay, so for this one I have 8 times 3. So what that means is I could have 8 groups of 3. So I could have 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so I could have 8 groups of 3, or I could have 3 groups of 8. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so here 3 plus 3 is 6, plus 3 is 9, plus 3 is 12, plus 3 is 15, plus 3 is 18, plus 3, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So this would be 24, and here 8 plus 8 plus 8 is 24. Okay, so now we have 6 times negative 2. So what that means is I could have 6 groups of negative 2. So then 6 positive groups. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So they're all negatives. So when they're all negatives, we just add and keep the sign. So it'd be 2, 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 8, plus 2 is 10, plus 2 is 12. So that would be negative 12. Okay, or, now when you do this one, we have to do it a little bit differently. If I do negative 2 groups of 6, because this negative, it gets a little goofy. Since this was a positive, we added, and now this one's a negative, so we're going to subtract. But you have to start somewhere when you subtract. Okay, so we always start from 0 when we subtract. So I'm going to start at 0. I'm going to take away 2 6's. Okay, so minus 6, minus 6. Okay, which is really the same thing as 0. Change subtracting to adding, negative 6. Change subtracting to adding, negative 6. So 0 plus negative 6 plus negative 6 would be negative 12. Okay. Now I have negative 5 times 4. So again, with that negative 5, we have negative 5 groups of 4. But when I think about a negative 5 amount of groups, that means we have to subtract. When we subtract, we have to start somewhere. So I'm going to start at 0. And now I'm going to subtract 4 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 times. Okay, so now I'm going to change that to adding the opposite. So 0, change the subtracting to adding, and opposite of 4 is negative 4, plus opposite of 4 is negative 4, plus negative 4, plus negative 4, plus negative 4, which equals 4 and 4 and 4 and 4 and 4. That would be 4 plus 4 is 8, plus 4 is 12, plus 4 is 16, plus 4 is 20, so negative 20. The other way I could have written this is we have 4 groups of negative 5. Now 4 is positive, so I'm going to add them together. So I'd have negative 5 added together 4 times. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, and negatives, they're all negatives, so we're all just going to add them together, keep the sign. So it'll be 5, 10, 15, 20, so it'll be negative 20. Okay, now this one, I don't know why this one doesn't have a number. This is problem number 4. We have negative 3 times negative 4. Okay, so when I do that, I'd have 3 groups of negative 4, but it's negative 3. So that means we have to subtract. So I'm going to start at 0, and I have negative, and I'm going to subtract negative 4 3 times. So minus negative 4, minus negative 4, minus negative 4. And really, we can change that to adding the opposite. So 0, change subtracting to adding. Opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. Change subtracting to adding. Opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. Subtracting to adding. Opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. So 0 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 would be 12. And it's positive 12 because we changed the subtracting to adding the opposite. All right, because we're really taking away negatives because we have negative amount of groups. Other way we could have done this is negative 4 groups of negative 3. So when we subtract, we have to start at 0. And I'm going to subtract negative 3. And I'm subtracting because it's a negative 4. That negative makes it subtracting. Minus negative 3, minus negative 3, minus negative 3. So that'd be 0. Change subtracting to adding. Opposite of negative 3 is positive 3. Opposite of negative 3 is positive 3. Change subtracting to adding. Opposite of negative 3 is positive 3. Opposite of subtracting is adding. Negative 3 to a positive 3. So 3 plus 3 is 6, plus 3 is 9, plus 3 is 12. Okay, so we just discovered a pattern. In this one, when we do a product, that means to multiply. Okay, the product, or when we multiply a positive and a positive, our answer was 24, so it was positive. Okay, so I'm just going to rewrite that down here so it's a little bit easier to see right away. Positive times a positive equals a positive, and I'm using that little dot for times. Okay, other ways we did it was with using those parentheses and they're right next to each other. That means we're multiplying. Okay, in this one, when we did the product, or we multiplied a positive and a positive number times a negative number, we got negative 12. So when we multiply a positive with a negative, we get a negative. Because either we're adding on negatives or we're subtracting. Okay, so I'm going to write that here. Positive times negative equals negative. Okay, the product of a negative and a positive. So here I had a negative and a positive, and either that meant I was subtracting a bunch, which was adding negatives, or I was adding negatives, so I get a negative number. So I have a negative times a positive equals a negative. Okay, and the last one is the product of a negative and a negative. So this one, when I had negative and a negative, that meant I was subtracting negatives. And when I subtract a negative, that's the same thing as adding a positive. So I actually end up with positive numbers. So negative times a negative equals a positive. Okay? So, 1, evaluate the following expressions. We only have one example. We have 4 of them. This should go by pretty quick. So you have 6 times negative 7. So I'm going to use my multiplication table because you aren't allowed to use calculators on this one. So when I have 6 and negative 7, I find 6 and 7, and I get 42. So the first thing we did was, what's 6 times 7? We just did the positives. Now I'm going to think about the signs. I have a positive times a negative, and that really means I have 6 groups of negative 7. And when I do negative 7 6 times, I get negative. So my answer should be negative 42. I wrote that really bad, so I'm going to rewrite it again. Negative 42 is my answer. Okay? All right, B, I have negative 9 times 10. So first thing we're going to do is what's 9 times 10, and then we're going to worry about the signs. Okay, so 9 times 10, on here I find 9 and 10, and they meet at 90. I'm going to put a little bit more space there in case it's a negative. And I have a negative times a positive. And a negative times a positive means I am subtracting 10 9 times, which means it's going to end up being a negative because I'm subtracting it from 0. So negative 90. Okay, negative 5 times negative 8. Again, we're going to do 5 times 8 first. Just worry about that number first. So 5 times 8 is 40. All right, and this time it's a negative times a negative. So remember that means we're subtracting negatives, which when I subtract a negative, that's the same thing as adding a positive. So my answer is just positive 40, and I don't need any symbols with that. Okay, D, this one I kind of snuck in there. This is an order of operations one. Okay, we're going to multiply. When we multiply, we go left to right. So I'm going to start at the left and move to the right. So the first thing I'm going to do is negative 3 times negative 2. So first thing I'm going to do is I multiply 3 times 2, that's 6. And now I think a negative times a negative. We just talked about how a negative times a negative is a positive. So I have 6 times negative 12. So again, I'm just going to multiply the numbers. 6 times 12. If I need to use my multiplication chart, I can. So 6 times 12 is 72. There we go. Okay. And then again, I'm going to think about my signs. So I have a positive times a negative. Positive times a negative will result in a negative number because I have 6 groups of negative 12, and I'm adding them together. When I add negatives together, I generally get a negative. It's a negative 12 plus negative 12 plus negative 12. Okay, so summary, when multiplying a positive and a negative, or a negative and a positive, so if we just switched it around, we get a negative. So that's the new information here. When multiplying a negative and a negative, we get a positive. All right, and that's it for the first lesson.